Horror. What is it? Why is it such an integral part of film? What draws people into this genre of film? And more importantly, what are the varying styles of horror films throughout the world, and why are they used? Some films take a gory approach in order to frighten their viewers.
No! Oh my God! Lawrence! Oh, what are you doing?
Some take a more surprising approach, opting to scare their viewers in bursts, utilizing tactics like jump scares to give the audience momentary, fleeting fright. Others choose to avoid both of these tactics. Some movies choose to take a more idealistic approach to horror. They attempt to get in your mind and produce real, undying horror.
Just be normal! There is no mother tongue!
But what are the benefits of these different approaches to horror as a genre? Try not to freak yourself out. You're about to enter the world of horror. Le Manoir du Diable, or The Devil's Castle, is often thought of as the first horror film. Created by George Méliès in the late 1980s, it is a silent film about a castle of the devil. Although this film is barely over 3 minutes long, and tends to focus more on humor and amazement as the main evoked emotion from the audience, it is still able to be called the first horror movie. The themes this film plays on gives it a horror feel, and the fact that it was the first of its kind gives it credibility as the first horror film. Since The Devil's Castle, the genre of horror films has evolved immensely. As the film industry has changed, horror films have changed along with it. The average length of films is now a runtime of a little over 2 hours, compared to the 3 minutes of The Devil's Castle. Despite the leaps and bounds that have been made in the horror industry, and the vast importance of horror as a part of film, the subgenres of horror are still a mystery to many people. To take a look at these subgenres, we will be taking a look at 3 different movies. Firstly, the Saw franchise, a group of US-made films that tend to instill fear in the viewer through generous amounts of blood and gore. Secondly, the Insidious franchise, another group of US-made films. Insidious tends to scare the viewers through jump scares and set design. The mise-en-scène of these films tends to set the mood and trigger emotion within the viewer, while the jump scares invoke fear and hatred and unpredictable terror within the viewer. Thirdly, we will be looking at The Babadook. The Babadook is an Australian-made horror film, and takes a different approach than either of the last 2 film franchises. The Babadook focuses on establishing real terror through the screenwriting and development of the film. Without further ado, the Saw franchise. As can be seen in the first scene of Saw 1, the Saw franchise has a very strong focus on gore. It is used very liberally throughout the franchise. However, to understand the reasoning behind this approach to horror, we must first look at the production of Saw. Saw was directed by Australian director James Wan. Initially, him and his partner, Leigh Whannell, attempted to get the script produced in Australia to no avail. The pair then decided to travel to Los Angeles, where they would eventually pitch to Greg Hoffman, allowing the film to be produced with Wan directing and Whannell acting as the lead. The script was then picked up and the horror production label Twisted Pictures was created. Wan and Whannell were given a $1.2 million production budget for the film. The script, along with the final edition of the film, used blood and gore to fuel the fear that was directed at the viewers. It was an effective method, but it was not the first time such tactics had been used in horror. Excessive gore had been seen earlier, in films such as Psycho from 1960 and Blood Feast from 1963. Despite not being the first, Saw is the most popular of the gory subgenre of film, often called splatter films. Splatter films are titled as such due to the excessive blood and gore used in these films, which can often be described as a splatter. Next, we will take a look at the origin of the Insidious films, the type of horror they portray, and the origin of this subgenre of horror. Even in the first scene, the impression that Insidious makes on the viewer is clear. It sets the scene with strong set design and mise-en-scène, and frightens the viewer with well-timed jump scares, leaving the viewer uncertain of the next fright. Interestingly, the production behind Insidious relates directly to Saw, which we looked at previously. Insidious, in fact, was directed by the same director as Saw, James Wan. Many people believe that Wan did not have a true ability to direct horror films, and that Wan could not direct true horror films, only splatter films such as Saw. Wan took this as a challenge, and decided to create Insidious to prove that he could make a successful horror film, without the violence and gore that was found within his earlier Saw films. As can be seen, Insidious makes use of trickery and jump scares in order to strike fear in the viewers. Jump scares are a very effective method of frightening the viewer. However, in recent years, many have looked at jump scares as a way to get a cheap scare. Jump scares are a relatively new tactic used within the film industry. Many appoint the first use of the modern jump scare to the 1976 horror film Carrie. Even despite the dislike for jump scares within horror films, Wan's movie was wildly successful, leading to the production of 3 more movies over the next 7 years. The franchise is very good at creating suspense, putting the viewer into a feared and edgy state. The movies then burst the viewer with horror in a well-timed jump scare. Overall, the movie was received very well, and Wan successfully proved that he could make a horror film in an entirely different subgenre of horror. Finally, we will be looking at The Babadook, an Australian horror film released in 2014. The Babadook was directed by Jennifer Kent, an Australian filmmaker. Prior to The Babadook, she had created a short film titled Monster, which she based The Babadook on. Kent's goal within Babadook was to create a film that would portray horror in a different light than the majority of horror films at the time. She wanted to show horror within the characters themselves, without needing to rely on jump scares or gore to get the point across. This can be seen within the film, as there are very few jump scares. Most of the horror is inflicted through the in-depth storytelling and character advancement. Despite the minimal use of jump scares, the movie still strategically uses them in order to really inflict maximum fear within the viewer. The movie builds up suspense through characters and strong screenwriting, and maximizes the fright with rare but well-timed jump scares. This scene is scary on its own, but the inclusion of it, along with the stellar storytelling, makes it far scarier than other movies are able to achieve. Overall, The Babadook's real terror focus is a very effective subgenre of horror. It uses minimal stereotypical horror movie tropes, and focuses on storytelling to portray horror within its viewers. Now you have learned about 3 of the strongest subgenres of horror films in existence. Next time you are watching a scary movie, try to recognize what subgenre it fits into. You'd be surprised how easy it is to identify the subgenre of a horror film if you are truly paying attention.